Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your meeting, Geology Matters. It's always interesting, coming from my point of view, being at these meetings every year, seeing what's new and where the thought processes in the industry are going, and seeing what new projects are kind of on the radar, which is of interest to us from an environmental point of view. So I gave the title of this talk, More Than Overburden, because actually overburden was a term that I had never heard of before I became involved in environmental assessments and environmental issues having to do with mines and quarries. And it's a term, I guess, that's used in mining to talk about what is above the, or that's of interest to the industry. Or if you're quarrying, it's not an ore, but. So it's all the stuff that's on top. And from our point of view, or from a community values point of view, the stuff on top is actually where we focus a lot of our energy. You know, the biodiversity, the ecosystems, the surface water, the things that bring quality of life to the community is in the overburden. And the point of this talk today is to talk about how valuing what's in that overburden can be just as important to a mine or quarry operator as looking at the ore deposits underneath, which is the focus of a lot of the presentations and the posters outside. And I did want to start with the message from the point of view of environmental groups and like Sierra Club. We do have valid concerns about impacts of mines and quarries. And those concerns can be categorized into different baskets, but sometimes it's just the wrong place or wrong time for a mine or quarry to go ahead. As we saw with the Digby Quarry, there was considerable conflict with community values and what they valued in terms of their community development. There's also concerns about water, impacts on water quality. The effluent that comes off of mine sites has been shown by national assessments performed by the Government of Canada, Environment Canada, to have decreased down the quality, fish habitat quality, and the biodiversity of benthic invertebrates, which are fish food, downstream. So national assessments have shown that there are long-term consequences of mines and quarries. There's also concerns about air quality and dust and potential health impacts. And I guess, as has been discussed today, there's issues having to do with reclamation and what will be the long-term consequence of a mine, which a mine may be there for 20, 30, 50 years, but as some of the presentations earlier this morning showed, the impacts can be decades to centuries, very long-term. So thinking about that is also something that's of concern, and I think it's a valid concern for communities and environmental groups to have. And just to place it in context of Nova Scotia, why this is of particular interest for industry here is we're a very small province. We're small in population, we're small in size, we're 1/20th the size of Ontario, which is, I think, according to industry reports, one of the most productive in terms of money value mining, in terms of mining activity. So compared to Ontario, we're 1/20th the size, which means there's no north, there's no outback, there's no area you can go in this province pretty much that isn't either a community or somebody's cabin or somebody's hunting area or some place that someone uses for recreation. So we're a small province with a pretty high value placed on quality of life, and surveys time after time show that in the Maritimes, Atlantic Canada. That is something that people really, really value. And that quality of life often relies on a very healthy environment and a vibrant community. And so we also, I guess stemming from that, we do have a very active community groups here that will react if they see something that is a threat. So these are all reasons why it's important to understand our context, but also to understand the importance of what I'm calling the overburden. And I should mention, recent reports have kind of emphasized this idea of the importance Nova Scotians place on community engagement and consultation. The recent province-wide consultations on fracking done by Dr. Wheeler from Cape Breton University, big focus you need community consent. The Ivany report, which talks about economic future for the province, talks about high regulatory standards being a prerequisite for that, because there is such a high expectation on the part of Nova Scotians that this happen. So just to talk about some of our activities that we've been carrying out sort of since pretty much the last 5 to 7 years, actually. So we've basically tried to initiate dialogue, initially through the Nova Scotia Environmental Network, Mining Caucus, with industry and government to talk about what are the common issues. And some of those first meetings really where you were speaking a different language. You know, I didn't know the term overburden, you know, things like that. So trying to find out where are the threads of commonality. Of course, we participated in giving input on the natural resources strategy, as did a lot of other groups. And then we went to work talking to the various community groups and environmental groups that do have issues with mines and quarries, and asking them, what are your stories? What are your concerns? And trying to figure out what would be the policy or cultural changes that could help address those concerns. And those are sort of outlined in a document called On Solid Ground, which if you check out our website, you can find that there. So community stories and potential solutions. And then, as has been mentioned, we helped create the consultation document for prospecting and exploration, along with the Mining Association of Nova Scotia and the Department of Natural Resources. So that was a real great first step about what should happen, what are the best practices if you are going to do prospecting or exploration. What the heck are you supposed to do? And I think that was a great first step in terms of process, but I think it's created a great document that's a great resource for industry. And finally, last February, we hosted something called Exploring Common Ground, which I believe was quite a groundbreaking occasion, where rather than just sort of coming together and saying what my point of view is and hearing from others, we tried to create an agenda that had a lot of expertise. So we started with a lot of information, and we did not misinformation, but real information from great speakers and experts, but then facilitated dialogue in the key areas where we think or thought we could address problems and come to some common solutions and create dialogue. And so those areas included consultation, alleviating fears, getting the information out to the right hands, and finding a common language. And then we kind of discussed next steps. So the first area we talked about was consultation, and consultations come up, I think, a few times actually in various ways in the different presentations I've seen. And the discussion was interesting, but also it was great how much common ground there was. So what we are recommending, or what we recommended coming out of that, is that we agree, or we think, that consulting early and often is in the best interest of everyone. And by that, we mean establishing clear lines of communication, being quite open about what's going to happen, and initiating feedback mechanisms. We also recommended that companies hire independent third parties to perform this consultation. There often is a sense that if you're coming on behalf of the company, it's kind of in your best interest to see the project go ahead. So creating sort of an arm's length relationship with someone who's going to be doing the consultation is actually sometimes in your best interest. We thought the government should be educating the public on areas of potential resource extraction. So there's clearly a lot of interest in gold on the Eastern Shore and different counties, Guysborough area in Nova Scotia. How about sort of planning it ahead so that communities, someone like Garth goes into those communities and talks about exactly what he was talking about. You know, this is the potential, these are the potential impacts, this is what it would look like, and hearing from them what their values are and what their planning, community planning is already showing, you know, that could be relevant to the project. And there was discussion that we may need mandatory rules for consultation just so that everybody is on a level playing field and understands what their roles and responsibilities are. It wasn't all hugs and kisses. Like, there was a discussion about different perceptions of risk. So if you're living in a community that's downstream of a project, you might be a lot more sensitive to potential impacts on fish habitat than, say, the mining company itself, who has a different perspective and says, well, my effluent limits are below the CCME levels, so I'm fine. So your understanding and your tolerance for that risk will be different based on your perspective. And we didn't resolve that in that meeting because it's basically an unresolvable issue, but we did talk about the fact that clear communication and maybe even communicating the fact that you understand the risk and you understand that difference in perspective and you will try to address it in various ways could go a long way. And yeah, all the way along I have some quotes, and this one in particular is from someone who's in the mining industry just saying, okay, I didn't realize it actually, some of the consultations or open houses, it wasn't actually working that great. So the second facilitated discussion had to do with alleviating fears, and some fears that people have are justifiable. People do become quite educated about projects and know or learn very quickly how they'll be impacted and understand them. So, just because it's a fear doesn't mean it's not a justifiable one. So some of the recommendations coming out of that, we're dealing with fears. It's best to be transparent from the beginning. If it's going to be an impact, let people know. Be open, and from the point of view of government and regulation, empowerment is very important. So if you're giving comments into an environmental assessment, it's important to know that those comments actually will impact the end result, if they are valid and backed up with good science. Again, the idea of independent third parties. So consultants who are working for companies often are perceived to be in the pocket of the company, even if they are very good staff and they do a really good job. So creating some independence there, and one of the suggestions was, maybe the funds go from the company to the government, who then arm's length hires the consultant doing an assessment. And I have to say, having done environmental assessments, sometimes that really does happen. Like, information in the assessment is not actually valid. So, if you go and get an independent expert, they will actually give you a different number of fish in that stream. So, and I've actually seen that happen. Having a rigorous consultation process, as I discussed from our last slide, is really important. And having response to concerns, not just we took your feedback, but we actually responded. Clear regulations, who's in charge, what's actually going to happen is really, really important, especially to communities where regulations can be already very confusing to deal with. So being really clear about what actually is going to happen is key. And creating a process so that this is part of the culture. There are really great players in industry and there are not so great players. And I guess on the part of communities, maybe there's communities that are a lot more sensitive to different projects than others. But maybe if there's sort of a consistent culture where this type of communication and consultation and regulation happens, we'll have a lot more clarity and actually efficient approval or non-approval of projects going ahead, but at least I think there would be a lot more clarity for industry and certainty for your investors. And understand that there can be unanticipated consequences was one of the key parts coming from the mining industry. So, we don't know everything, and there can be consequences we don't know. So creating a common language was key. A lot of misunderstanding happens because we don't really understand either the terms that are being used on both sides or how they're being used. So the suggestion was to create a glossary of terms, and it was pointed out that MANS actually has a good glossary on their website, and it looks like Garth has done a bit of glossary with his consultation document. But the idea was maybe putting these resources together and having them vetted by the various stakeholders so that they're actually of use to everyone would be great. Making more information accessible, and a lot of that discussion, there's very detailed comments in the report, and I should say the report for this workshop is on your table, so please take one with you. Very detailed recommendations on how that could be improved, and great responses from the government bodies in the room about what could happen, because it's often in their mandate to improve their communications. Create a one-window process for communities was also one of the suggestions. The one-window process here in Nova Scotia is established often to, or is established to, create an efficient way for the proponent to understand the regulatory process and the various government bodies they are going to have to deal with. From the community point of view, it does mean that there's a lot of dialogue and information exchanging hands that we don't know about. And that creates, again, fear and a lack of trust. So there was a suggestion that we create a similar process where we are informed all the way along as well, just as proponents are. And the suggestion that the government create a liaison personnel or an expert to help communities navigate industry and regulations. So, and the last one is getting information into the right hands. We need to ensure that citizens are aware of existing information. It was pretty clear from the dialogue that there's tons of stuff up there that we don't know about. So again, it's often within the mandate of governments, and it's in the best interest of industry that all of this stuff is out there. So working to improve that information. I know a lot of the mapping information is quite inaccessible to community groups, or we don't know where it is, or even the presentations from this meeting, where are they, that kind of thing. So improving that, and lots of suggestions on that could happen. And again, the one window came up. So this is another way for communication to happen. So creating that liaison person who will be telling the interested community leaders and NGOs, non-governmental organizations like mine, what's going on for projects that we're concerned about as it happens. So you don't find out 2 or 3 years down the road that a mine has been in the works. And there was some concern in the discussion that community liaison committees are not really working as well as many people hope they would. And I know from communities or groups that have become engaged in projects, there's a sense that the community liaison committee is sort of part of the process of approval, or almost a body of the industry itself. So there's hesitance to sit on there with, and to really, participate in an active way, even if you are the most knowledgeable group or individual on this project, if you have a lot of criticisms about it, because you're worried you're kind of being co-opted and you're not hearing all of the information you need to know. So talking about changing how these CLCs, community liaison committees, are structured, I think is a good thing to think about for the work ahead. And I guess one of the good quotes from the meeting was, "We may not have found common ground, but we do have some tools to build a bridge." And I really wanted to emphasize that the meeting itself was so important. I mean, the recommendations and the next steps, which I'll talk about, are equally important, but the meeting itself and the energy in the room was quite significant in terms of, I think, what we accomplished and who we had there, and we wanted to grow. In other words, it was not a root canal. And here we have Barb Markowitz, who's in the room from Eastern Shore Forest Watch, and Pat Mills, who's the head of MANS, after 2 days of grueling talk, actually having a good laugh, so which was really great to see. And so the meeting itself was really, I think, really changed things for a lot of people, and I want to see that continue. One of the reasons it was so successful is that we had a really great keynote speaker who talked about a concrete example of where change is happening, and he's with the Stillwater Good Neighbor group, which is a legally binding document. Stillwater is a mine in Montana. They have a legally binding document with them between the mine and the community groups that creates a whole bunch of roles and responsibilities having to do with safety, community development, water and air quality. And it obligates the company actually to consult with these community groups, and they actually fund environmental monitoring of the mining impacts based on what those community groups say is important to them. So we're concerned about stream quality. We want to do research on that. They will help them. And one of the concrete examples that Paul Hawks, who came from that group to talk to us, that he gave that I think people can understand is there's a lot of workers going back and forth to the mine would be, the idea. And they would have been driving on community roads and highways and possibly creating traffic and safety problems. So the Stillwater groups came together and they suggested, why don't you just have a bus? So there's less traffic, less safety issues, less noise issues, and will take your workers into the mine every day. And of course, this costs the mine money, but it actually in the end worked out to be in their best interest because it means everybody gets to work on time. So this is the type of resolution that you can come to when you come to the same table, as he's emphasizing in his quote there. So some of the next steps coming out of the meeting, let's keep the discussion going, and that's partly why I'm here today, is to reinvigorate the discussion and to call on you to participate in moving forward on this. The other next step that was just at the meeting, and I think it's sort of happened in the form of Garth Demont, so it's creating a position within natural resources to advise proponents on consultation and help communities locate relevant information. So over the past few months, we've been meeting regularly and seeing how that position is being shaped, and that's really interesting. Good to see. And the other next step coming out of the meeting was to establish multi-stakeholder groups on mines and quarries, and I haven't talked much about quarries in this presentation, but it really is one of the orphan issues, and that was really clear in the meeting that a lot of community groups are concerned about, that pops up time and time again, but there's no clear solution to the problems they're encountering because of issues with regulation. So who regulates them? They're regulated by Department of Environment. There's very little involvement with natural resources, even though most people would consider, as Garth said, a mine and a quarry from the outside to be a very similar thing. So I am calling on the participants here to step up at this time and help us take on some of these next steps. In particular, I'm really interested in forming a multi-stakeholder group on quarries to take up the challenge on improving consultation early and often. Start using the document that's got all the best practices in it. If you're a prospector or doing exploration, start using that and start reporting back about what you're finding out, because that's the only way we'll know it's actually being used. Help us bring in new players, particularly from industry, but municipalities, other people who should be at the table for these multi-stakeholder groups, and hopefully we will have more meetings in the future, so let's keep talking and acting. So thank you very much.